So just coming in a little early to confirm everything's in order so that we don't face any problems later. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining in. We should start in another 2 to 3 minutes. Okay, so just stay online. Oh, hi Govind, nice to see you here. Okay, great. Yeah, so I think we're all set up and ready. Govind has given me the go ahead, so let's begin. So guys, it's a pleasure to be back here once again. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Sudipta Sarkar, an advocate practicing predominantly in the Supreme Court of India and the High Court of Delhi, and also certain tribunals including the CCI and the NCLAT. Today I'll be talking about a subject which does not get a lot of discussion in general because it's not considered very prominent in our competition law jurisprudence as of today. So it's collective dominance in competition law. So at the very outset, I'm going to make something very clear. As of today, collective dominance is not recognized under Indian competition law. The Competition Act does not recognize it. So then obviously the very first question comes, why is he even talking about it in the first place? He could have spoken about so many other topics under competition law. There are two reasons why I do that. One, because it almost did make it into the Competition Act. Unfortunately, it got dropped. Secondly, because its absence in our competition law jurisprudence and its lack of recognition under our act is leading to serious ramifications in the development of our competition law jurisprudence and in the adjudication of cases. And I'll go on to show that when I come to our own act and I come to the Indian portion of this entire talk today. So let me first start off with what is the definition of collective dominance, because the phrase sounds very simple, but it took even the European Union some time to actually come up with a formal definition for this. And that is where in fact this concept first originated. So under the original European Commission Treaty, you had Article 82. That today has become verbatim Article 102 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which came to govern the entire European Union in the year 2009, and it's been continuing on. And I'm going to quote from that straight away. And I quote, "Any abuse by one or more undertakings," now please note this phrase, "one or more undertakings of a dominant position within the internal market or in the substantial part of it shall be prohibited as incompatible with the internal market insofar as it may affect trade between member states." So obviously this is what is considered as abuse of dominant position. In general, it's a very standard concept, it's simple, but the phrase one or more undertakings is what became very significant over time, because it showed that Article 102 of the TFEU did not just per se recognize one dominant entity. It recognized that there could be more than one dominant entity together, right? Or there could be two entities acting together, and which together by their actions end up in a collective dominance. So which is where it first came in the year 1992, which was in the Italian flat glass case. And I'm quoting from this because this is the first time when the European Court actually gave a proper definition of collective dominance. And it said collective dominance is independent undertakings to be united by such economic links that by virtue of that fact together they hold a dominant position vis-a-vis the other operators in the same market. So that means it essentially, there are two components to what could be considered as collective dominance. One was there was common conduct between two or more entities, and secondly, that common conduct led to these entities operating as one single entity in absolute parallel. But then the question came up because it didn't solve the issue here. You will recall, as I just quoted, that the Italian flat glass case noted economic links. So the question which started coming up over and about time is what constituted an economic link in the first place? And secondly, how would such an economic link enable undertakings to adopt a common conduct? So essentially, what are the factors to even determine what would be a common economic link between entities by which one can actually determine collective dominance? And this kept coming up, but then it was finally clarified again by the European Court in the Air Tours case of 2002. Now, the Air Tours case of 2002 was slightly different from the Italian flat glass case in as much as it was under the merger regulation. So how it works is, even a merger regulation can be challenged in the European Court after a decision by the European Commission, because in this case the European Commission had rejected permission for a merger of Air Tours with another operator. And so they ended up coming in appeal. And this is where the court clarified that it clarified two things, and two very prominent things. One is that collective dominance can be either structural or it can be contractual. The structural part was what was part of the Air Tours case, right? Because that was under the merger regulations. The contractual part is something actually we don't see a lot these days, because most such issues in the European system, economic system, get sorted out under the 2004 merger guidelines. So you don't see a lot of that happening in the European Union itself. But there is the US Visa MasterCard case, which I will come to later, and that is a classic case of a contractual collective dominance case, right? But we'll come to that a little later, because we need to first, in fact, there's a second very important part to this judgment. The second part was, the court said that there are three stages which need to be met and which will help determine whether an economic link leads to a collective dominance. First, that the market is transparent. This means that one competitor or one entity within the same market is generally aware of what the other entity is doing in terms of the practices which it adopts, the products which are out there, right? The market strategy which is being used. And you often find that that is often the case, because irrespective of what entities or people might say in general out in the public, most of these entities are generally in the know of what's happening and what is being done by the other competitor as well. Secondly, there has to be a sustainability or an adherence to a common policy. That is, it is not just enough for you to know what the other is doing. The fact of the matter is, you should together not only be doing something, which you should be taking a parallel strategy, let's say, but more importantly, this should be sustainable. So it can't be one time. Okay, so one example might be, let's say, just a one-time advertisement blitz of some form, or a one-time discount which is given to customers. But that would not classify as a permanent sustainable economic link. A sustainable economic link would be it continuing for a significant period of time, right? And thirdly, there has to be an absence of competitive constraints. In other words, and the other way to say this is that the combined de facto entity by this common strategy, which is sustainable, has to actually be dominant in the first place. So for example, let's say there are 10 different competitors in one relevant market, and 4 of them join together, but the 4 of them are, let's say, just have 5% each. So therefore the combination of 20% is perhaps not enough for the actually to be collective dominance, because you have, let's say, one large entity which already controls 50 or 60% of the market. So therefore that would never qualify as collective dominance, because even the combined strategy adopted by these 4 is not leading to dominance for them, right? So the combined entity together, or this de facto entity, has to be dominant as a whole. And this is in fact the test which has been adopted till date, and it is on the basis of this that the Air2's merger eventually did not happen, unfortunately, right? Or fortunately, I mean, of course this was a long time ago, so things have changed. So it's also, and I will talk about this more, how markets with time tend to change, and therefore what was collective dominance or could not have been collective dominance once might become a case of collective dominance later. But for now, let me first then move on to the US, because this is where, like I said, you have that first major case of shall we say, the contractual aspect of collective dominance. In the US now, you have the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which determines all antitrust cases. You have the Clayton Act as well, but for our purposes, collective dominance would come under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And here you have the Visa MasterCard case, which is frankly one of the best cases, in my personal opinion, of collective dominance, and one of the most significant cases of competition law in general. We'll talk about the US one, but action was also taking place against these two entities in Canada as well. So let me just come up with, give you brief facts. You obviously both know Visa and MasterCard, very prominent entities in the credit card space. Now what happened was, how these transactions work is that Visa and MasterCard enter into agreements with the respective banks. The banks enter into agreements with these card companies by which cards are issued. So therefore either a Visa card is issued or a MasterCard is issued, and accordingly when you swipe that particular card to, let's say, make a transaction, accordingly the cost and expenses get divided between the two. There's a whole technical side of this transaction which taking place behind as soon as you swipe the card, and part of the cost is also recovered, in fact, from the shopkeeper or the person to whom the money was paid. Because you'll recall, it might have even happened to you a lot of times, it's happening less today because costs have come down, but there was a time when the cost for a shopkeeper was significant. So often you would have cases where the shopkeeper would be reluctant to accept your card, saying it's better if you pay me by check or by cash because I have to pay the transaction fee on it. So that used to happen about 5-10 years ago. Fortunately for them, costs have significantly come down, so these days they are less, they complain less about accepting your credit card or debit card. But anyways, both Visa and MasterCard, obviously they together had very significant market. Individually, neither of them had, let's say, a 50% plus market share, but both of them together were obviously, individually they were significant entities, and both together would obviously be nothing less than a behemoth if the two were ever to merge. So what happened was, these companies, they both started entering into agreements with banks by which they would not compete against each other in the bank. So therefore, and you would have even noticed this, in fact, that the bank would issue a Visa MasterCard as a Visa credit card as well as a MasterCard credit card. But what they did start putting as a clause in the agreement is to exclude other card companies, the most prominent being American Express. Okay, and there were a lot of course, regional card companies as well. So South America has its own card companies. We now have RuPay in India as well, which has become very prominent in our country because of the promotion it received. And therefore, other than Visa and MasterCard, which are the two largest entities, every region has a few other regional credit card or debit card companies which operate and have their own market share. What Visa and MasterCard started doing, and this was happening in South America as well, so North America and South America, because a lot of the banks of North America also have branches in South America, so it started affecting the market share there as well. They started entering into clauses where they said, Visa and MasterCard, you don't have to worry, we're not competing with each other, so we're good. You issue a Visa card, you issue a MasterCard if you wish to, but do not issue, you are not allowed to enter into an agreement with either American Express, which was of course the most prominent third entity and which in fact brought about the complaint in the first place, or those other regional entities predominantly in South America. This caused a big problem in one sense, because other than the fact that you are excluding other competitors from directly competing with banks, you, by not competing with each other, have become this huge dominant entity to the extent that there is therefore very little negotiation which started happening between rates. And you do see that happening even as of today, but till a lesser extent, because now there are certain remedies which have taken place post this case. If Visa and MasterCard did not need to compete with each other in terms of rates, because there's always this competition of how much percentage of a cut you're going to take, right? The credit card company will have that. If they did not need to compete against each other, therefore it led to a situation where these two entities could collectively rise at the exclusion of all the others, right? And therefore it was considered by the US court, because this went up till the Federal Court of Appeals. Okay, so it was a pretty big case. In the US court, the only other appeal against the Federal Court of Appeals is right up till the Supreme Court. So they have a different federal system there. The Federal Court of Appeals specifically stated that by entering into such collusive agreements collectively, it was a violation. It was clearly that of a collective dominance, because these two entities together, while individually they may not have a 50% plus market share, but the two together were nothing less than one huge credit card company or a debit card company, which could basically end up controlling this entire market of issuing credit cards to the banks. And that is where, which is why in fact even I personally feel, and I'll go to show even in India why it is so important to actually bring this about, why it's now become so important to actually recognize collective dominance in our own competition jurisprudence. So now let me come to India, because obviously that's our home country, and that's actually why you probably tune into this talk into the first place. Obviously we have the Competition Act of 2002. The Competition Act of 2002, like I have already said, does not recognize the concept of collective dominance. But the reason, you'll also recall I had stated that it almost did make it. And that is where the Competition Amendment Bill of 2012 comes in. So the Competition of Amendment Bill actually brought about an amendment, proposed an amendment in Section 4 of the Act. And I'll actually quote that. It actually wanted to bring in the words in Section 4.1, right, after the word group, jointly or singly, which you'll recall is very similar to the wordings in Article 102 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. It wanted to insert these words under Section 4. Section 4 is abuse of dominant position, right? 5, 6 are combinations. The reason it wanted to insert is specifically to recognize the concept of collective dominance. Because even by that time, even by 2012, there were a number of cases which were being rejected by the CCI and eventually the COMPAT on the ground that collective dominance is not recognized under the Act. Unfortunately, in 2014, this bill lapsed, and very recently you had the Competition Amendment Bill of 2020, which I believe was just put up in public domain in March. There, sadly, this specific amendment has been dropped. So the Amendment Bill of 2020 as of now does not wish to recognize collective dominance at all. Now the counter question which might come to me for those of you who do deal in competition law or who have some idea about competition law is that Section 5 and 6 do recognize and have inserted the words jointly and singly. So an argument which could be made that therefore, at least as per the concept of mergers and acquisitions, for the purpose of mergers and acquisitions, collective dominance is recognized. I would partially agree with you there. Yes, obviously the concept of collective dominance is recognized under Section 5 and 6 to that very limited specific extent for mergers, but please also remember that there's a threshold for a mergers and acquisition, right? And that threshold, if it is not met, then two entities or more entities do not need to actually even inform the commission of such a merger happening. Right? Secondly, there's another concept where it is just two intra-group entities which are merging. They again don't need to inform the commission, or maybe they just need to inform it, but they don't need to actually get a clearance from the commission of such a merger. So effectively, the concept of collective dominance, if one has to actually make an interpretation within the Act, is so minuscule under Section 5 and 6 that it is for all practical purposes redundant. And this is more than evident by the fact that till date there's not a single case concerning collective dominance in the mergers area which has ever come up before the commission. Like, whereas on the other hand, my own research has shown that there are at least 34 orders. There might be more, but my personal research has shown that there are at least 34 orders of the CCI or the COMPAT or the NCLAT which specifically state that collective dominance is not recognized within the act, and therefore we can't take any more further action. This information cannot be acted upon. The matter is disposed of or dismissed. Appeal is dismissed, as the case may be. And I'll just come to some of the very at least what I consider to be very prominent cases at that point of time when they were actually filed, which were very good cases for consideration of the commission, provided collective dominance had been recognized. So one example is the N. Sanjeev Rao case. Right? I'll just confirm the year. I believe, 2012. N. Sanjeev Rao case was also case number 49 of 2012, and the issue here was regarding NBFC auto finances, that is motor vehicle finances. There was a trend, the complaint which was made, that there was a trend observed among all the auto finances, NBFCs, that they're offering very similar rates and very similar terms and conditions. So effectively, there is no practical competition between any of them. At max, maybe just a 50 basis points, that is a 0.5% difference in interest, and maybe because of a tie-up with a particular car company, there could be certain better terms for that specific car, but beyond that, there was no other effective competition between these entities. There, unfortunately, because of collective dominance not being recognized, the court specifically noted that none of these entities are individually dominant. It's a vibrant market in the sense that there are a lot of entities in this market, but actually the only reason they did not proceed with it is saying because collective dominance is not recognized. So if collective dominance had been recognized, you would find a situation where a lot of these entities acting together being collectively dominant, and therefore there was a very valid investigation which could have taken place on the terms and conditions which they were imposing, right? Also, secondly, what the commission had said was it did not differ. So what is happening? That was N. Sanjeev Rao. The second one, which at that point of time was very prominent, but since the market has changed over time is not so prominent now, was the case of Dish TV in the year 2014, subject to correction. 2013, my bad. So it was 2013. Dish TV was a case where Dish TV actually made a complaint to the CCI saying that the multiple service operators were actually imposing together, because they operated in a specific state together, were imposing detrimental conditions not only towards Dish TV, but because Dish TV had very little chance to actually negotiate better terms with them, or because of the lack of competition between them, even though individually these were all extremely small operators. So for just to give a background about how the market used to work, because a lot has changed since then, but how it used to work was you have local cable operators. The local cable operators buy their signals from the multiple service operators. Okay, and the multiple service operators, some of them might be running their own channels, which does happen at the state level, because it's the same entity which is running a multiple service operation and is also running a media channel of its own. But the multiple service operators in turn buy bundled channels from companies, right? So that could be from let's say the various individual media houses, or they could even enter into terms for, let's say, providing a free service. So for example, Doordarshan, which as per the government has to be provided all across the board, irrespective, without any cost. The reason Dish TV came into the picture here, because at that point of time, Dish or DTH was a rising, growing market and a growing concept on the way TV media should be dispersed across the individual households. And Dish TV said that because they also need to purchase that license for a particular state from those multiple service operators. It said that, look, one, as it is in a particular state, most of these multiple service operators are basically owned directly or indirectly by the same entity, one way or the other, because they all are colluding one another. And because, especially let's say in the case of Punjab and Haryana, though it's happening everywhere, especially down south, but particularly because their complaint was related to Punjab and Haryana, since a lot of politicians are involved, these politicians are always behind the board, are colluding with each other, who have very similar terms between them, and therefore they are not able to negotiate individual rates. Secondly, it is often happening that while at a pan-India level, no multiple service operator is actually dominant in that sense, because multiple service operators will generally stick to their particular states. It is very rare, or it was very rare, for a multiple service operator to actually be going out of one state into also having a market in another state. But even there, in the case of Punjab and Haryana specifically, since there was active collusion by the promoters, because they were all connected, being politicians themselves, therefore they were unable to actually negotiate better rates, and therefore together, while individually there was no dominance, together all of them within a particular state were exercising collective dominance over that specific market, state market. Once again, the commission said that, look, collective dominance is not recognized in the country. There are clearly a number of entities even in one particular state. Secondly, you as it is don't provide services on just a state basis, you provide services on a pan-India basis, or definitely more than one state basis, so therefore that is your relevant market, which I personally disagree with, but be that as it may. The end result here for our specific purpose is that since collective dominance was not recognized under the Act, therefore no further investigation actually took place. Another case, and actually there's a batch of cases, is, and I've also argued some of these cases, but from the side of the private entities who were accused of bid rigging, is the ethanol blending cases or the LPG cylinder cases. Now in both these cases, the accusation that was made against the private entities was of bid rigging. The argument which we had taken in counter, saying that, look, there can be no bid rigging in the first place, because one, we don't decide the final L1, L2, L3 bidder, because that's how it works. It is the oil companies which are all working together. So what the oil companies had done is they had together formed one common entity which would hold one common process for selection across all their plants, right? And all their different areas where they had actually set up some sort of, either for ethanol or for providing LPG services, LPG cylinder services. There they said that we had countered, saying that, look, firstly, there can be no bid rigging because it is they who decide L1, L2, L3. Secondly, more importantly, they in fact counter. So how this bid process used to work was, the L1 bidder who would win eventually a certain tender quantity, as the case may be, would then, the company or the entity, the oil company, would actually write to the L2 bidder saying that, look, this is the rate which we've received, are you willing to provide at this rate or not? And if you can't provide at this rate, sorry, you can frankly get lost, because we'll approach somebody else. So effectively led to a situation where all these companies were anyways forced to accept that rate, which anyway the oil companies were providing. So it was a case of one hand already tied behind your back. Thirdly, what was happening was, this was well known in the industry, right? This is not something which came out in the public, but it was well known in the industry, is that there was already a fixed rate of these oil companies which had been taken by way of an internal decision, meaning that they would not accept anything more than this rate. They would accept a rate less than that, but not more than that under any circumstances. So for example, if they fix their internal rate at, let's say, 100 rupees, there was no chance of them accepting 110 or 120. They would accept 90 or 80 because that would be a better rate for them. Right or wrong, this rate was always known to the private entities because it always got out one way or the other, which obviously it had to happen because there's a human element involved here, and it's very easy to finally figure out what rate these oil companies are preferring for a particular area. So naturally, none of these entities would actually bid above that rate, knowing very well that the rate was going to be rejected. Ultimately, what they used to try and do is to bid very near to that level or less than that. But the difference between L1, L2, L3 used to be so narrow purely because of this reason, that because they knew the rate and because it is the oil companies which eventually fixed the rate and just gave them a piece of paper saying either sign this or sorry, there's nothing else which is acceptable to us, it led to a situation where they effectively had no choice, and obviously they were therefore quoting close to that ceiling which had been put by the oil companies themselves. So there, because the matter finally went up till the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finally held that, look, it agreed with us saying that, look, they clearly can't be a case of bid tricking, because it's not a case where they are colluding with each other. It's just that they're giving rates similar to what you already have provided as a seal, and which you later force them to conform to pursuant to your letters, when even the L2 and L3 bidder is forced to conform to the price which has been accepted by the L1 bidder, right? That is a scenario. This entire case was in a scenario where collective dominance is not recognized under the Act. Now imagine a case where collective dominance had been recognized under the Act. Then the question comes, is there a case of collective dominance? One could actually argue there might be a very good case of collective dominance for certain areas, not just from the private entities who are supplying the cylinders or the ethanol, but even, let's say, from the oil marketing companies. Because though this was an argument which was made against the oil marketing companies by us as well, saying that, look, it's not us, they're the ones who actually are anti-competitive because they've colluded together to fix one market rate. That, however, was rejected. But there's a very definite case of collective dominance which could be made for in specific states against the private entities or against the oil companies themselves. But obviously, since it was never recognized, it never came to that. Similarly, another case which we're seeing right now, because actually I've written on this earlier, is the Ola Uber case, where Fast Track Cabs actually filed a complaint against Ola and saying that they are abusing their dominant position and they're entering into anti-competitive agreements. At that point of time, obviously, other than the fact that the court said that collective dominance is not recognized, I have in fact written an article where I have actually argued that even if, let's say, collective dominance was not recognized, was recognized under the Act, that case could not be made out in that complaint. However, that was approximately, I believe, 3 to 4 years ago. Yeah, it was in 2015, so almost 5 years ago. Now, post the pandemic, a lot has changed. Because now, and you would have even noticed this if you are using these services still to now start going to office, is that the rates between Uber and Ola have become very similar. And they are not giving those random discounts or perks which they used to give to their drivers earlier, 5 years ago when this complaint was filed. So since the market scenario has changed so much, it's actually a very good opportunity to test whether now, post the pandemic, whether there could be a case of collective dominance between Ola and Uber together. Because now, and anybody can notice this, their level of hyper competition has come down between the two of them, because naturally both of them have already suffered very serious losses. So the only way to actually get over and tide over this crisis which they're currently facing is to not be engaging in this predatory pricing or hyper competition which they were engaging in post the pandemic. And therefore now it becomes a very good question whether they've been engaging in collective dominance or not. Now, other than these three, what else I can talk about in the sense, if I have to actually talk about specific cases, because that becomes very important, is if you look at in general how our entire market system has been progressing across various sectors. We are seeing, and we were seeing since the last 3 to 4 years, and we're seeing this even more now post the pandemic, is that the level or the number of small entities is not only reducing but will continue to reduce over time. Because as time goes by and once this moratorium ends on 31st August, there's a very good chance a lot of these entities will end up in insolvency eventually, and they will not be able to actually compete in the market with the larger entities. In this scenario, post the pandemic, I personally feel it becomes even more important to start looking at collective dominance, because all these entities, whether directly or indirectly, whether it's intentional or even unintentional, there's often not a specific mindset to actually enter into a collective dominance scenario. All these entities will not be looking at individually competing with each other. They'll be looking at survival for the next 1.5 to 2 or maybe 3 years. If they are looking at survival, and if competition is not that important to them anymore, they will definitely be considering ways in which they have to compete less, and they can gather or incur more revenue over time from their individual customers. The only exception to that as of now appears to be the telecom industry, but for the very simple reason, you already have one entity which has become significantly dominant in the market. And because what has happened is that since this entire process started 4 years earlier, not just only because of the entry of this new entity, but the regulations over time which aggravated the situation, you have come down from 11 entities to today effectively 3 private entities and 1 public sector entity, and with the public sector entity and 1 private entity basically on the tenterhook. So you really don't know whether 5 years down the line there's actually going to be a viable business between for these two in the first place or not. So with that, and I see there are a lot of questions, so I'd like to start answering those questions as well. I close my talk now, just to leave you with the thought that post pandemic, the entire market scenario all across our country, in almost every major sector of our economy, is now going to undergo a drastic change. And therefore, it is more important than ever before to try and get this concept of collective dominance into our competition law jurisprudence, for the very simple reason was, if we don't do it now, by the time we actually consider doing it, it might be too late, because under no circumstances, or at least a very plausible argument could be made, that it cannot be implemented retrospectively. It would have to be implemented prospectively, but by that time the damage will already be done, right? So with that, I'm sure Govind should be coming online soon himself, so I'll wait for him. And in the meantime, thank you so much for tuning in. And if you really want to read more about collective dominance, about competition law in general, I run a blog, the Indian Competition and Antitrust blog, so feel free to check that out. And with that, I'll start now looking at your questions and wait for Govind to tune in.
Hi, Sudipto.
Hi Govind, how are you? Am I audible?
You're audible. It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure, man.
Perfect, thank you.
It's always a pleasure to just hear you talk and just, it's like reading a book, man. Seriously.
Thank you
Just
so much.
everything is so well explained, everything. I literally, I did not know much about collective dominance before the start. Literally, it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's great to have you again.
Yeah, great to be here as well. I'm so happy to have come here. But I see there are a lot of questions. So in fact, I wanted to stop midway and then start answering those questions, because they're coming one after another. But then I thought, let me first finish my portion and then I'll dive into them.
So what would you like? Do you want to finish your portion? We can take the questions at
No,
the
I'm
end. What
actually
do
done.
you?
So in terms of my portion, I'm done. So, oh yeah, it is a nice outfit. Janvi has put a nice
Oh,
comment
thanks.
on your outfit.
Yeah, we were trying to. But we got so many questions. I can't. Okay, I can't
Yeah,
even keep
exactly.
track.
It's crazy.
Oh,
So could you please just read them out to me, because there's no way I could keep up with them.
okay, I'll just read. So Abhi Nawal says, why can't cases of collective dominance come under anti-competitive agreements since they cause an anti-competitive effect?
Yeah, so I discussed this in my talk right now. The reason is because as of now, the Competition Act under Section 4 only recognizes one dominant entity. Secondly, when you look at anti-competitive agreements, so that's the contractual side of it, okay? And there would have to be a very specific case of collective dominance, because you have to understand there's a big difference between anti-competitive jurisprudence and abuse of dominance jurisprudence. An entity does not necessarily have to be dominant, but it could still have an anti-competitive agreement, with that particular customer, in relation to that particular customer, or with, let's say, another business entity, in relation to the back cycle of the flow, as they call it, of the entire product flow. That's not the case with the abuse of dominant position. So to answer his question, since anti-competitive agreements, if you actually read section 3, it only deals with very specific cases where an agreement becomes anti-competitive. So as of
Okay.
now, none of those specific cases within section 3 would actually cover cases of collective dominance, because you couldn't make that accusation against multiple entities. That you can only do in the case of a cartel, right? But the
Okay.
threshold for proving a cartel is much higher at the end of the day. So I understand people often get confused between collective dominance and cartels because they think that it's basically the same thing. But there's a very specific difference between the two, because in a cartel, there has to be a very specific agreement between all of them in collusion. Whereas in the case of collective dominance, there doesn't necessarily have to be a specific collusive intent, and that's very important. It is very much possible, and this is where Air 2s comes in. So Air 2s in this three-stage test, actually what it meant by sustainability was this: that people can always enter into similar, let's say, parallel advertisements or parallel market strategies, but if that market strategy can sustain over a significant period of time because of how the market is structured, even if they don't want to actually collude with each other, it leads to collective dominance.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very, very. So if they couldn't just be colluding, but they'll still be collective dominance, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's
So
actually
there
very
doesn't have to be
interesting.
an intent to do something wrong in collective dominance.
Wow, that's but so they could just one day be just क्या कहते हैं, they could just one day just be picked up by everyone and go like, listen, you guys are all in on it and they don't even know each other. They're
Yeah,
like,
so
oh,
so I'll tell you that's exactly what happened in Air 2. So Air 2's, when it was merging with another entity, with the other entity wanted to actually purchase it and merge it with itself, the commission said that individually neither of these entities were dominant, and there were four other entities in that relevant market. But
okay.
when the merger would happen, if let's say theoretical merger was to happen, the combined entity,
So
right?
I'm sorry to stop you there. So let's
Yeah.
just take something for example of Amazon. Like I don't know
Yeah.
if it'll apply here because what I've heard is this is what I've heard, a little read about it. The reason Amazon is not bought in the scope is because it doesn't make that much money from its dominant position.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But
So
then,
if
okay, so
tomorrow
then the question comes whether Amazon is dominant in the first place or not. So this
it
is
is,
the
it definitely
entire
is.
argument which is going on right now. Because what Amazon is saying is that, firstly, we are not the dominant entity in the relevant market. Firstly, there was a big argument on what is the relevant market. But then, because there was this huge debate that how e-commerce cannot be considered a separate marketplace. I disagree with that, but that was a debate which was going on. Fortunately,
Okay.
that later changed because CCI actually came out with e-commerce guidelines, and now you actually have specific rules even by the ministry governing e-commerce. So at least then you today
Correct,
have the
correct.
differentiation where the e-commerce market is a separate market of its own. But then the next question came up: in India, Amazon may not be the dominant entity at all, because you have Flipkart here, you now have Geo here, and you have a number of these other small entities which run their own e-commerce marketplaces, which creates a situation where Amazon might be dominant in the US because obviously they're much bigger there and they're much more
Yeah.
broad based there, but they're not as broad based here in India as of now. Flipkart is much more broad based in terms of logistics, of transporting goods. So that creates a big issue, and that's actually still pending. And unfortunately, since a lot of that data is confidential, so we in the public don't know very well exactly
And
how much the
unfortunately,
value of the transaction which actually happening, and
since
what
a
is the
lot of
exact
that
market
data is
share, which pin
confidential,
codes
so
they're
we in the public don't
sending goods to, they
know
don't send
very
goods to.
well
So a lot of that data is
exactly and how
confidential
much.
right now.
Unfortunate.
But as a whole, there is a strong chance that Amazon may not be dominant in India, but collectively the two could become dominant. Why is he going is left? Why? Okay, we'll just wait 2 minutes. He might have dropped out. And other than if that doesn't happen, then I'll try to answer your questions by going up this chain. Thanks, Janvi. Oh my god, there's so many questions.
I left and there were 3 questions already, man. As soon as
Yeah,
I
that's what I'm getting
I was like, what
scared
the hell
now. How are we
happened?
going to do actually all this? But let's try and do whatever we
Shit.
can.
So Deepta, you're on fire, man. Yeah. So you were talking about Amazon,
Yeah, so Amazon may not be dominant here in India, but you have to understand something. I spoke of collective dominance, obviously, but the issue in Amazon or concerning Amazon and even Flipkart right now is not that of collective dominance, it's about their anti competitive practices with respect to the vendors. Because Amazon, and this is a big debate not just in India but all across the world. Earlier, initially, Amazon used to only be a marketplace, right? So there'd be vendors who would join into its system. They would be selling goods through Amazon, and Amazon would take its own cut or look at logistics, and that's where it would end. Something similar to eBay, right? Except in eBay, you would be bidding as well. That has changed now because over time, not only has Amazon purchased brands of its own and started brands of its own, but it has actually started exclusive products which are very similar to the products of the vendors who are there in this market. So I'll give you a small example. You look at keyboards, right? There's something called Amazon Basics. The keyboard market in general was a highly competitive market because it was very easy to actually make a keyboard. The technology was out there, so everybody could be actually making a keyboard and bringing it out there into the market and putting it on Amazon, Flipkart, etc. Amazon has come out with Amazon Basics, where they're giving the exact same keyboard with the Amazon logo and selling it at a 50% reduction in cost as compared to the cheapest vendor. So
Yeah.
then the question comes, if you're going to create a situation where the vendor who joined you can no longer effectively compete with your own product, which you have yourself brought into the market, then are you not creating a situation where that vendor is going to suffer harm because of your conduct? The debate in its essence is whether Amazon should be allowed to compete with vendors itself. So either you be the marketplace or you be the vendor. The entire argument is Amazon should not be allowed to be both. Because Amazon is taking, you have to understand, Amazon has a whole system set up from, let's say, manufacturing to warehousing to software services to logistics to the end customer. It's controlling everything from A to Z, which in one sense is good if you did not have other vendors on your platform as well. You could always do something saying that, okay, I'm not going to accept any more vendors can leave, I'm going to only run it as Amazon products. That's fine. That's what in fact even Apple does. If you notice, Apple, it's all integrated within their own system, and that's why they're even giving up Intel chips now. That's the entire logic, that we want to put everything in-house, right? That's not the case with Amazon. So if Amazon chooses to do that, then let go of the vendors. But you can't have vendors ask them to give you a cut of their revenue, but yet be competing with them, which results in a detriment to their own revenue.
Yeah, correct, definitely. It's a weird situation.
Yeah.
We've got so many questions. Okay. So there's another question. This is by Akriti Dua. I'm sorry if I forget the name because there were so many questions. I could only get the question, write everyone's name. So sorry. I'm going to just say the questions out here to all the viewers. Okay. So I got Akriti Dua. I got 2 of her questions. Is collective dominance judged by actions, consequences, or intent?
Intent less so. Actions and consequences more so. Because intent, as I've already said, is not necessary. There has to be a specific intent to collude in collective dominance. But the action and the consequence are definitely very important factors in the 3-stage test to determine whether there's collective dominance or not.
Okay, so basically you would say that, he has to do something, right? Or he has the intention of doing
Both of them,
something.
yeah, not just one, but multiple of them should be doing something. And there should be sustainability. So it's not as if they've done it one time. That doesn't count as dominance. But they should be doing it for a significant period of time over and over again.
I hope you answers your question. Otherwise, Sudipta's got a blog. What's the blog's name?
So feel free to go there.
What's the blog's name again?
Indian Competition and Antitrust blog.
And I think you started this back in college.
Yeah, actually started it back.
So I remember seniors coming to our class, like Sudeep, and just coming to Sudeep and going like, "Listen, we love your blog." Like practicing. It used like, I just write it because I like it. So second question by Anukrit Dua is, which industries are most likely to come to collective dominance? Like, what is there a sector? Would you say that this which industry is most prone to being hit by this?
As of now, today, because of the scenario of the last 3 or 4 years, the banking and finance industry, definitely. Because you have a situation, there are two things which have happened. One is, of course, banks themselves have been suffering a lot in terms of their own finances. And secondly, you have NBFCs which have been suffering as well. So a lot of
Yeah.
the smaller NBFCs are going to eventually close down or wind up their operations. That's bound to happen because there's no way they actually have the liquidity to sustain themselves. The bigger ones, you will start noticing, it's already happening, but you'll start noticing even more. It will become more prominent over time. Not only will their terms become similar, very similar, but their returns. So, for example, even NBFCs borrow money. So let's say they borrow money from mutual funds, right? That's debt fund. That's debt funding. Essentially,
Okay.
that debt funding is giving money to these entities, which they can invest and get returns. Because returns have crashed so much, and because the market is so skewed right now in terms of liquidity and how much cash is actually available and to whom it is available, which is more important since the smaller ones are not getting money. You will find over a period of time that the rate of interest, not only in terms of cost but also in terms of return, is not only going to come down but also become very similar. So the margin of difference between the two is going to start coming down. And actually the reasons for this are multifold. So it's not only from a competition perspective, and that can be a whole different lecture. So I don't want to start that now. But
Yes.
just to summarize it in one line, is there is a fundamental failure across the Indian financial system right now to understand and assess risk. In simple terms, nobody knows how to decide whom to trust, who should be given money, and from whom money can be expected back. So, because of this lack of faith in the entire system, it's not as if this faith can't be again rejuvenated. It happens over time and it runs in cycles. But as of now, at this very moment, because of this fundamental failure across the entire financial system, you will see a situation happening where the bigger ones are going to remain with the bigger entities. So, for example, and you want the best example of this is HDFC. There's a
Okay.
reason why HDFC and HDFC Bank, even despite all this crisis, both these entities are among the strongest financial entities in our country. There's a reason
Okay.
for that. Because both these entities, HDFC Bank is part of HDFC, and now you have HDFC AMC, the asset management company, which has now segregated itself. Their ethos of doing business and of lending and taking money was so conservative and has been conservative for such a significant period of time. And since they've carried out with the strategy from the very beginning, they've never had to suffer all of this. So that's the reason why in the entire market crash which happened, HDFC
2008.
crashed far less as compared to many other banks.
Correct. Correct. This,
Because
this
there's
was
a
a major
huge
point.
trust which people have with HDFC and the HDFC Bank, which is not there with many other entities.
True. True. I've heard this. Even I heard this. Like our institutions were able to withstand it. Versus a lot of people in the world.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So Azure Rocks
essentially,
has
finance
been
is all about trust. So again, there'll be no specific intent to collude, but you're only going to give money to people you trust, plain and simple. If you don't expect money back from somebody, like say, for example, if you don't trust me that Sudipta is going to return back money to you, you won't give me money. You'll just make up some excuse to not give me money. In simple terms, I mean, at its core, that's really how it works in the financial system. So if you set aside all the jargon, that's really how it works.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Actually, it does. So Azure Rocks has asked this question 3 to 4 times now. So I
Okay,
think
sorry.
I should finally ask him this. Can you elaborate on the price reduction by Jio in the telecom sector? Is it, according in your opinion, anti-competitive? And listen, just in case the session ends, we'll start the second session because there are more questions. Okay.
Okay, sure.
So yeah, so that's and his point is that which even I had this question was personally They suddenly came and they reduced the price of everything. But I saw this. Like I started getting calls from Vodafone, Airtel, and everybody's like, "Listen, take our plan, take our plan. We'll give you this, we'll give you this." They were giving Netflix subscriptions, Prime subscriptions, we were just getting one number, which of course I made use of, and I'm sure a lot of people did. But then
Yeah.
Jio ruined the market for the telecom. It literally led
Yeah.
to Vodafone being, from what I know, it just led to a
Yeah,
position of
yeah.
being, in a bad state. And, if I remember reading one time, Vodafone was one of the biggest entities in the world.
Yeah. It still is, but in India, the market has severely shrunk. Sadly
Yeah.
for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a slightly long answer, so just bear with me.
It's okay, we got time. If you have the time, we've got the time. Everybody's
Yeah.
here.
In my personal opinion, Jio crashing prices down is a clear case of predatory pricing.
Okay.
But there's a big caveat here. The question is, how do you determine predatory pricing in the first place? Jio has been very smart, and in all fairness to them, I mean, very typical of how Ambani, in all fairness to them, भाई मुकेश भाई को जो कहना है कि लो धंधा करना आता है. In very simple terms, he knows.
Okay.
Not only, of course, is he influential, no doubt, which he definitely is with across any government, not just this government, but even the previous government. But they are smart. Reliance is smart in how it goes about his business, which is why if you'll ask your your senior generation, there used to be a very common anecdote of invest in Reliance and work with the Tatas. Because the Tatas were considered the best employers at that point of time. But if you want
true.
to make money and investment, then you invested your money in Reliance. Because Reliance was definitely going to rise. But anyways, there are two things which are happening. One is Reliance was smart enough to enter the market at the time where pan-India 4G licenses became available. Because before this, you could not purchase a pan-India license at all.
Okay.
You had to purchase only individual circle licenses.
Okay.
So what Jio effectively did was it got a license to provide services throughout the country. And this is what happens when you're a late mover into the market. Because since the telecom sector was at a relatively nascent stage in the late 90s and post 2000, Bharti, Voda, all these other entities, Hutch, because it wasn't Voda, then it was Hutch, they had to make significant investments to create the market in the first place. Jio did not have to do that because Jio simply bought the pan-India license, which at that point of time became available. Whether that's right or wrong, I'm not going to go into that because a lot of water has flown down that river. And in all fairness, it is definitely an easier way to go about doing business, to have a pan-India license as compared to individual circle licenses. Secondly, Jio is a classic case of throwing money at building a market. The sheer scale of, there's less than 2 minutes remaining. So the sheer scale of money that has been thrown in by Jio, not just in providing basic telecom services, but also purchasing a lot of startups. So you would have noticed in the past 2.5 years, Jio has purchased a lot of startups which it is now integrating with the Jio platform to create this huge Jio digital ecosystem, which it wants to then advertise, and similar to what in fact even Amazon was doing, except Amazon never had a telecom license in the first place. But Amazon has done it in its own way in its e-commerce.
Yeah, exactly what Amazon does. Right, you're right.
Yeah, right. Because of that, and because of the sheer scale of money which they've thrown into this entity, they've been able to crash prices down. Okay. The reason this became a problem for other entities is because Airtel, Voda, all of them, because they had to purchase, because you have to understand, they were purchasing 2G and 3G as well, right? They've been in this market, so they have to cater to older users. Jio has never bothered with 2G, 3G customers. It has only bothered directly with 4G because they purchased a pan-India 4G license.